Hi there, U.S. history students. So this lesson today is one of my favorites in the school year. I find this story to have just a really interesting emotional resonance. I think there's a lot of unique and special connections to our home here in the state of Minnesota. And I just think it's a real interesting opportunity for us to kind of live into our storyline of the blessing and the curse. So this lesson is called Conflict with the Plains Indians, and it really is a kind of a continuation of some of the conversations we had in semester one regarding the Native American peoples and the United States. And this lesson has a kind of a tragic feel to it, and that's appropriate, that's okay. And so you can see a learning target. I can explore Minnesota's Native story. We'll do that a little bit during the lesson and then some during a homework reading. I can analyze America's shifting Indian policies and for the most part, lack of success in those various Indian policies. We're assessing America's rise to greatness. You know, we're rising to become an economically great power. And we're going to do some assessment of that work today. And then also this last final long-term learning target, I can view American history through the lens of biblical justice. We're going to need to be careful about doing that today and doing that well. I think that's a way for us to learn thoughtfully in a Christian school context. And so let's jump in here. Like I told us, this lesson, we're kind of continuing up from where we left off before. I mean, like throughout semester one, a few times we talked about the intersection of the United States story and the Native American story. And in many ways, the whole policy, such as it was just move west, go that way, get out of here. And the problem is, if manifest destiny is continuing to march west and move from sea to shining sea, then the solution of for Native Americans or indigenous peoples, for them to just go west, that's not a real permanent solution. That's the solution that works for a generation at a time, and then once again, it'll stop working and just lead to more conflict and more dysfunction. This is such a dysfunctional story today in so many ways. I think we're going to be able to see that. So where we pick this up, in Unit 5, we got 250,000 Native American peoples living west of the Mississippi, a whole wide variety of lifestyles and tribal groups, and their ways of life, their various ways of life will be brought to an end because of the expansion of the American way of life, the United States way of life, involving, railroads and economic development and farming and settlement and all that stuff. That's just going to bring an end to what the Native American groups and Native American tribes had. And our storyline talks about when we see a curse, we understand, we lament, we respond. We're going to work on understanding. And I think the lamenting part will just come naturally for us. This is a story today of the dysfunction that's created when two different worlds collide, all right? Two different people groups who see something like a natural phenomenon, like these massive herds of millions of buffalo, bison in North America. And for Native Americans, that would be a great natural resource, something of great religious significance. And for white settlers or for Americans, or specifically for railroad companies and for farmers, this is a nuisance. This is just something that stops economic development. It literally stops trains in their tracks for days at a time. It stops farmers. You can trammel, you can destroy fields for farmers. This is something that has to be dealt with and gotten out of the way. And so, Americans have this horrifying achievement in the 19th century of the near extermination of buffalo from North America. They were driven down to, there was less than 1,000 by the time that this whole process was completed. And it's not as if this was an organized, planned operation. It's not as if at some point, President Ulysses S. Grant leans forward into some intercom and says, "Exterminate the buffalo." That's not it. It's the farmers wanted them gone. The railroad companies wanted them gone. Everyone wants them gone. So they're just killed senselessly because they served no economic or cultural function for the United States of America. But in that process, the extermination of the buffalo made it impossible for Plains Indian groups like the Dakota or Lakota here in our neck of the woods, or the Cheyenne or other groups to continue their way of life as they had lived it for centuries now. And so things destabilized badly in their own worlds. And then as their situation is destabilizing, the United States is moving in, and that's going to lead to more instability and conflict, and in the end, some resolution. But the resolutions are unsatisfying resolutions. They aren't resolutions that look like mutual flourishing by any means. So again, where I'm starting is just sort of like, this there's two ways of life in conflict here, right? And so, like I know, you have like mining companies, railroad companies, farmers coming in. The land conflicts are constant. The policy of the United States continued to be this reservation policy. Just move them into these areas, right? And it's sort of like making a deal. It was making a deal. And the basic deal, Native American groups or tribes were told, hey, look, here's the deal. You give up your right to move wherever you please, right? And follow the buffalo, for example, in the case of many tribes here around here, or to do whatever you'd like. You give up that right. You surrender that right, and you agree you will move to some stretch of land that we will provide to you. And I mean, the first thing Native Americans will notice is you can't really hunt buffalo on those stretches of land because the buffalo they're moving around. That requires like a wide swaths of land. That's not really possible. And so the United States would say, yeah, so you're not going to be able to hunt buffalo. So, I mean, we'd encourage you to do a whole bunch of stuff. We'd encourage you to start farming, and farming in the way that American settlers would farm, not necessarily in the traditional ways that some Native American groups were farming, but like farm the way we do in more organized and efficient, I guess, patterns. Also, we'd say, we'll pay you. So you don't need to use the buffalo to provide for yourselves anymore as a self-sustaining group of people. Now we'll pay you. And once a year, we'll give you these annuity payments. And with those annuity payments, you can buy food and provisions and stuff for yourselves. And that creates a culture of dependency. It doesn't look like flourishing. It just looks like, you agree to sit here in this land and we will pay you this money. And that's not good for anybody. That's just not a really good situation. The only people it's good for are the local, Americans or local whites who want access to the land, free of buffalo and free of Native Americans, free of the, what's perceived as the threat of Native Americans. For the most part, Native American leaders accepted these reservation deals for reasons we're going to explore here in a second. Mainly, they accepted them because they were smart enough to know that there just aren't good options on the table. This is the worst of the bad options. But frequently, I mean, if we can note in here all these little kind of salmon-colored pockets, which are all these reservation territories, all these reservation territories are just powder kegs ready to explode. They're unstable situations where people are sort of being forced to stay on this chunk of land, being paid out payments, which, by the way, frequently, especially in the case of the thing we're going to read about, those payments were late or they would be short, right? And so they're waiting on receiving government payouts that weren't there frequently in order to survive. And when people can't sort of live the life of their choosing, a life rooted around the values and practices that are meaningful to them, that will lead to deep discontentment, and it can lead to deep resentment and anger. Wouldn't it for you? And what we have across the latter decades of the 19th century are these explosions of violence, these bursts of violence. We call them the Indian Wars. That's a shorthand term. But like it's not one sustained long war with these long campaigns. It's a set of short campaigns that happens in episodic fashion. And sometimes they aren't even really wars. Sometimes it's just a massacre. And look, I have to be really clear. No one comes out of this smelling like a rose. Native American groups are frequently doing violence that we would look and analyze and just say that's unjust. And frequently the United States government is committing actions and violence toward the Native American groups that you look at and just say that's gravely unjust. Nobody smells great coming out of this. And at the end is the sort of the violent or the ability of Native American groups to resist the United States advancement into the West is destroyed, dismantled. Now, these actually, if you can believe it or not, they kind of begin in Minnesota. And you're going to read about that. In 1862, during the Civil War, we experienced one of the first of these, if not the first of these conflicts. And it used to be in Minnesota called the Sioux Uprising of 1862. Today, we just call it the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. Because the Sioux Uprising is sort of like, and then out of nowhere, they left the reservation, they started killing us. And yeah, Native Americans in Minnesota did leave their reservation and they did start killing white settlers. But as you'll read, there's a whole backstory to why that happened. And then there's a whole back and forth war that goes on and a lot of crazy, messy, but very interesting details. I'm excited for you guys to read that and to hear some of your thoughts that you have in response to that. These wars are long and complex, and there's, again, it happens in sort of fits and starts throughout between the 1870s and 1890 or so. But I'll tell you about the most famous of these conflicts. The most famous of these particular battles is the Battle of Little Bighorn. And this is perhaps the most famous because it's the exception to the rule. And in general, in world history, the rule is when industrialized nations make war against indigenous groups of peoples that aren't industrialized, the industrialized nation wins virtually every time. And there's like a couple exceptions, not many. One of those exceptions is here in the United States in this Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, a bit of backstory. The Battle of Little Bighorn is fought between the United States Army, led by a general named George Custer, and it's fought against an enormous, perhaps the largest single moving village in North American history. This village of some 10,000 organized by Sitting Bull. So Sitting Bull is leading not only Lakota and Dakota, who are sometimes called Sioux people, not only his own ethnic people, but also Cheyenne Indians who were joining up with him. He was an interesting guy. He's not really like he was a warrior figure, but really he was a religious figure more than that. He was like a religious mystic. He did have a man named Crazy Horse with him who was known really as a military leader, a military figure. Anyway, so they're living on this area that they'd always lived on in way out South Dakota, Montana, the borderlands area there called the Badlands region. That was of little interest to the United States because it's not really especially well suited for farming. And so they had been ceded that land. That's land that they'd been given. Trouble began for them when gold was discovered on the Badlands. And once gold is discovered, it's super predictable. It's super gross. Like whites begin moving into Native American territory to get access to that land. And they begin moving in saying, at some point, the government's going to come and back us up and they'll kick these Native Americans out of here. They'll set up some new deal and we'll have access to this mining territory and we'll have access to this gold. And Sitting Bull said, well, I'm not signing a new deal. This is like religiously significant territory for us. We're not going to sign a new treaty. President Grant, this is another kind of L in Grant's, resume. Grant says, look, move them out of there. All right, this is going to be a disaster. Like either there's going to be conflict between sort of white settlers spontaneously fighting Native Americans and it's going to be some crazy wipeout, or it's going to be like the United States government moving them out of here. I don't like either of these, but Grant just says, just move them on out of there. He orders the army to move them out, and then we're going to sign some new deal, and we'll make it all legal and neat and tidy, and we'll get access to this territory for gold mining. Sitting Bull, though, just says, I'm not doing it. And so in 1876, this U.S. Army force moves into the area, led by General Custer. And Custer, if you've ever been to the Badlands area, if you've ever had to drive through it, it's these like kind of rolling hills. And Custer just makes this mistake. There wasn't only 700 men. There was several thousand involved in the whole force, but Custer and his men get too far ahead of the rest of the army. And Custer doesn't quite realize how far ahead of everyone else he's gotten, where now he's several days ahead of everyone else. And Custer also doesn't recognize who he's fighting against and quite how large the village and the army is that he's fighting against. In Sitting Bull and his men, he doesn't realize it until it's too late. And Custer makes any number of mistakes. I mean, the whole thing was probably a mistake, but his aggressiveness was a mistake. He splits his forces in two in the face of a more superior numbers. That's a mistake. And so Custer and his particular group, his particular half of the men, they're totally wiped out and annihilated by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and his men. And a few people live to get out and tell the tale. And it's this horrifying tale for the rest of Americans. I mean, Americans initially are like, oh my God, what has happened? And like, this was such a debacle around the world. And for many Native American people then and now, this was sort of the final hurrah, the final moment of victory before the inevitable defeat. And it has real resonance, interesting resonance today. And it's worth just sort of slowing down to pause and consider what response we have to the story of Battle of Little Bighorn and this pattern in our history that we see from time to time. I mean, this is a massacre in the end. It's like Custer and his men could have surrendered. I'm sure perhaps did try to surrender, but that wasn't happening on this particular day. In spite of a victory like that, most Native American leaders recognize we're not going to win. They recognize we can't win. You'll read this quote, but this Native American chief this Dakota chief in Minnesota named Little Crow, or Taoya Teduta, when his young braves are like pushing him to attack, let's leave the reservation, let's fight against the Americans. Let's read what Little Crow said. He says, "See," again, he's saying this to the young men in his tribe, "See, the white men are like locusts when they fly so thick that the whole sky is a snowstorm. Kill 1, 2, 10, and 10 times 10 will come to kill you. Count your fingers all day long, and white men with gun in their hands will come faster than you can count. Braves, you are little children. You are fools. You will die like the rabbits when the hungry wolves hunt them in the hard moon. Taoya Teduta is not a coward. He will die with you." It's these kind of poetic and brave words. I mean, someone like Little Crow, who is a chief, you don't become chief because you were born into that position. You become chief because you're commonly recognized as having uncommon leadership ability, and frankly, often uncommon ability at kind of public speaking. Hold on, please. Okay, pardon that interruption. The United States government often would be making deals with figures like Little Crow, would put them on a railroad and kind of wine them and dine them and bring them back to Washington, D.C. and show them cities like, Chicago and Pittsburgh and Baltimore along the way, in part to signal they'd be treating them ostensibly honorably. But part of the message is there are so many Americans. There are so many, people in our cities, and there's so much technology here. There is no way you can win a war. And in a sense, that's what Taoya Teduta is telling his men here. Like, I've seen more than you've seen. I don't think you understand. Here in Minnesota, it's a frontier territory, so you might think, we can win this. We can't. You don't understand what they have and how many of them there are. But even in the end here, he says, if you're going to fight, I'll fight with you and I'll die with you. You get a sense of like, this is something that is, it just is this tragedy. It's this inevitable tragedy. And almost like a Shakespearean tragedy, everyone from the beginning of the story to the end knows how it has to end. In the final throes of it, we see the emergence of this so-called ghost dance movement. And the ghost dance movement is like a religious, apocalyptic religious movement. And it's basically like, if we do this ghost dance that takes like a long days and days to do. If we do this ghost dance, this religious ceremony that involves all this stuff, I'm not even going to get into the details, but if we do that, then that will bring back the buffalo and or make all the white people disappear and or just bring an end to the whole world in general. And any of those would be better than the current scenario that we're facing. And so the ghost dance movement was often tied with acts of violence or with Native American groups then sort of feeling empowered to leave their reservations and go fight. And so what would happen would be farmers would hear stories of like the tribe on the reservation 20 miles down they're doing the ghost dance and someone's got to do something about this and we got to get army forces up here to put this down. And so proactively, the U.S. Army begins coming in to put down the movement through violence, and so this is the sort of what sets the table for the last pieces of violence that happened between the United States government and Native American groups, and in particular at this place called Wounded Knee in 1890. It's hard to even call it a battle. It's really more of a massacre of the last of these Native American communities, these reservations that are doing the ghost dance movement. And so it's like this reservation, the groups that are resisting the U.S. government are sort of finally put down. And it's hard to look at this reservation policy and give it anything more than a D- or a failing grade. I mean, it was unsustainable. It didn't sustain itself. It led to inevitable violence, right? and it was put down with great violence, and innocent people were killed violently. It was just hard. It's hard to just look at this and say it's a just situation. And what replaces it is something that's just a mess in kind of a different way. It's a policy of forced assimilation. And this is a policy put in place by, I think you can say, well-intentioned government officials, well-intentioned whites were doing this. And it just said, what we need to do, like to get them to stop doing this, we need them to acculturate to American ways, to leave their own culture and become more like Americans, become sort of adopt white culture or Christian culture. And so in order to do that, what we have to do is we have to kidnap Native American kids out of their own villages and away from their own families and bring them to faraway places, like, for example, Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. This is the most famous. There's a number of these schools here in Minnesota. Separate them from their families, bring them to these schools. Here we will Christianize them. We'll cut their hair. We'll sort of, the phrase was, we'll kill the Indian, but save the man. Teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic. We'll teach them to want something different in life. And we'll sort of sever their connections to their culture so that they, as a people group, that they can go home and teach the rest of their people how to Americanize and adapt and become part of our modern system. And what ends up happening in virtually every case is these guys in this picture finish school, get out of school, and go home and grow their hair out and take the clothes off and return to who they were. Return to sort of the original roots of what was instilled in them from their early childhood age. This just never took. It never worked. It was abandoned, not because it was unjust necessarily, but because it just simply did not work. And also because at a certain point, people start saying, is it bad that we're pulling babies or kids out of the hands of their parents to do this to them? Like, I think it might be wrong. And I think we moderns tend to look back at it and go, yeah, that was pretty wrong. That was pretty screwed up. The story, it's just hard. That story leads us into the 20th century. I mean, that policy is finally dropped around about 100 years ago. Again, dropped because it's ineffective and humanitarian concerns. Then for a long time, for decades, the basic policy here in a place like Minnesota is just to Native Americans, you just stay on your reservations and basically languish in rural poverty, and we're not going to think about you, and please try not to bother us too much. Some court cases in recent generations, again, starting in Minnesota. There's a Supreme Court case that started in Minnesota that came out with the official ruling that sort of affirmed a reservation is a sovereign piece of land, and state governments and the federal government have no right to tax Native Americans living on an Indian reservation. Like, that's their own sovereign territory. We don't have a right to tax them. And Native American groups and lawyers associated with them began probing the bounds of that and said, well, I mean, if it's a sovereign territory, can we set up certain things like, for instance, casinos that would violate American laws or the laws of American states? But could we do that since we're a sovereign territory? And I suppose to their credit, they coordinated that in cooperation with states and with the United States government, because they said, we don't want to cause a huge conflict, but it seems like there's legal ground here for us to do this. And the United States agreed, yeah, you have legal ground to do this. And so what we began to see in the 1980s is the opening of what we now just recognize as Indian casinos. And these Indian casinos open up, and they have this interesting situation in which in most states, they're operating without any competition from anyone else, because they have sort of these special carve-out laws. The casinos in Minnesota are only legal to operate on an Indian reservation. And we're a bit distorted. We have a bit of a distorted view here where we live at Southwest Christian because we're in the shadow of Mystic Lake. And Mystic Lake Resort and Casino is the single most affluent Indian casino in the United States because it's tucked into the suburb of a major metropolitan area. All Indian reservations have casinos. Like, you're looking at Red Lake Indian Reservation up in northern Minnesota. It's not like they haven't thought of having a casino. They have a casino too. It's just that nobody lives up there. So it doesn't make nearly the income. It doesn't make a fraction of the income that Mystic Lake makes. And so Mystic Lake draws in a ton of money. And you might know friends. I've taught students whose families live there. I've taught students who made more money in 2 months that I make in a year, because their families get this much money, or that student when they turned 18 would start getting X amount of money from Mystic Lake Casino, right? Right in our own net backyard is a tribal group that's profited handsomely. That is the exception to the rule, because the vast majority of Indian casinos do not look like that. The vast majority of Indian reservations are among the poorest places in North America. They're among the poorest places in the United States of America. And we allow our understanding of Mystic Lake to distort the general story of what's happening with Native American groups in the United States, which is just not a pretty picture to this day. And I'm just going to leave it on that note of unresolved suspension. That's okay. That's where we find it. That's where it is. That's okay. Well, it's not okay, but I'm just going to leave it and say the next chapter will be written by you and your generation. Gang, thank you for your work on this. Good luck on the homework reading. Have a good day.